Australia will be there. Australia will be there.
In this video we will show you where the Australians fought during the Battle of Fromelles. A major feature on the battlefield was a German fortified machine gun post known as the Sugar Loaf. On the battlefield it formed the divide between the British on the left of the map and the Australians on the right. The German front line went through the Sugarloaf and onwards to what is now the Australian Memorial Park, while the Australian front line went very close to VC Corners Cemetery and then continued to Cordonnery Farm. The Australian line in this sector was 1.6 kilometres long. This is the overlay of the actual wartime trench map, the red lines being the German trenches and the blue the Allied. Back in the early years after the battle, it was known to many diggers as the Battle of Fromelles. Fromelles was the closest town to the battlefield under British control. We will now proceed to look at the battlefield as it is today. We are starting with the 59th and the 60th Australian Battalions, which were the two battalions closest to the Sugarloaf. All the infantry battalions taking part in the battle were part of the 5th Division AIF. The 5th Division was divided into 3 infantry brigades, each consisting of 4 infantry battalions. The 59th and 60th Battalions were part of the 15th Brigade under the command of Pompey Elliott. This road is Rue Petillion. Behind us is Rue Delvar, which goes to Fromelles. Pompey Elliott's headquarters was located at the end of the Penny Avenue communication trench, about 180 metres to the right of this house. Historically, this would be the road where a weeping Pompey Elliott come out to assist the returning survivors from the battle. On the left is the Trou cemetery, which is often referred to as the most beautiful on the Western Front. 56 Australians are buried here, with only 4 being named. All were buried after the war. During the battle, this cemetery was just too close to the front line for safety of the living burying the dead. Just stop the film to show you that the moat goes all the way around the cemetery. Note how high the water table is here. Back in 1916, this stopped the digging of the traditional in-ground trenches. This plaque appears at the gatehouse of all Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries in France. The cemetery was started back in 1914 when a British aid post was located here. There are a total of 350 graves. We are now looking for one of the graves to an Australian, Alexander Patterson, a member of the 32nd Battalion. He was a Sergeant Major of C Company before being promoted to Second Lieutenant. He went missing during the battle in the early morning of the 20th of July. In 1923 his remains were found on the battlefield and were buried here. Looking through the willows you see a farmhouse. This is situated just behind the Australian front lines. Another named Australian was Fred Reed, who was a 29-year-old carpenter from New South Wales. His remains were located on the battlefield in 1920 and identified by his ID disc. Just up the road to the left is another cemetery called Rue Petillion, where 127 named Australians killed during the Battle of Fromelles are buried. This cemetery was in use during the battle, having a number of trench burials. These are recognised as the gravestones are placed side by side. Standing in front of the Trou cemetery, the fields to the left of the road is where the 60th Battalion formed up for the actual attack, behind the breastwork trenches. The Australian trenches ran about 100 metres in front of the farmhouse, then turned towards the clump of trees which indicates the position of today's equestrian centre and the VC Corner Cemetery. As mentioned before, due to the high water table, trenches had to be built up from the ground. I think the trenches in this photograph have not yet been completed, as it would be normal to have a rear breastwork. Thus the men would be sandwiched between the two walls. To view the area of the Sugarloaf, we cross Rue del Var and proceed up the private farm track. Bean's official history shows the Australian front line to be 420 yards from the Sugarloaf. This measurement brings us to this point. Visually, the area over which the 60th and the 59th Battalions fought is shown here. We will now locate ourselves on the ground at the point. We are facing in the opposite direction to the Sugarloaf. The wall of wheat could very well represent the men of the 59th Battalion lined up, ready for the assault. While here in this location, we wanted to show you that just behind this house on Rue del Var is the location of the old trench called VC Avenue, of which a corner gave its name to VC Corner Cemetery further down the road towards Fromelles. The trench map coordinates on the sign are correct and point to the next intersection along Rue del Var heading away from Fromelles. This is the view across the ground that the 59th Battalion advanced. The 60th Battalion was more on the left side of this film. As no man's land varied in width, so did the times that the men went over the parapet. The 59th and the 60th Battalion started their advance at 5:45 p.m. Imagine yourself doing this attack. What strikes everyone who visits here is that the ground is so flat, offering no protection, and the attack was done in bright sunshine. What were the planners of this attack thinking? The 59th proceeded through the furrows of once cultivated flats, crossing an old farm ditch and some grassy hammocks. It came under increasingly heavy fire from the Sugarloaf. Today the fields are the same as in 1916. One can easily see over the whole of the battlefield. The tree arrowed is actually situated on the banks of the Lay stream. We will have a better look at that in a minute. This is the area where the Australians come under heavy machine gun fire from the Sugarloaf. As the British attack onto the Sugarloaf had failed on the right flank, the German machine gunners bore down onto the Australians, virtually annihilating the 59th Battalion men. For the family historians, the 59th A Company was on the right and the 59th B Company was on the left. The red line represents the German trench, starting at the Sugarloaf. The greatest concentration of dead and wounded of the 59th Battalion was from the Sugarloaf to the Lay stream. You can use the two small trees to give an indication of the location in the field. For the 59th Battalion, it had been annihilated within 15 to 20 minutes of leaving the trenches. Captain Aubrey Littlelow commanded A Company of the 59th Battalion. One of his men said, "On going over the parapet, the captain was wounded in the head, but he rose at once and led us on. He reached the German line with only a handful of men left, and in going over their parapet, he was wounded in the shoulder and again in the arm. But nothing daunted him. We withdrew to a shell hole. He was asked to retire as his wounds needed attention. Littlelow said, 'I will never leave the men who I have led into such grave danger.'" The 59th Battalion attacked in 4 waves at 5-minute intervals. The third wave left the parapet at 5:55, expecting to see their mates advancing ahead, but they could observe no movement anywhere, only unkept pasture with the dead and wounded scattered thickly. On the left, the 60th fared no better. With the 4th wave, the battalion commander and staff followed. In the case of the 60th, these men fell almost immediately. Major McRae, receiving a bullet wound to his neck, was killed 80 metres from the parapet, with his second-in-command, Major Elliott, being killed soon after. A witness saw Major Elliott go down. Shortly afterwards, he stood up and tried to get his tunic off. He got it off and then pitched forward onto his face. He had a big gash in his back, as if from high explosives. His batman remained with him until he died. The witness said that Major Elliott was one of the best. Of the 60th Battalion, which had gone into the fight with 887 officers and men, only 1 officer and 106 men answered the call after the battle. In the next sector was the 53rd Battalion on the right and the 54th Battalion on the left, commanded by Colonel Harold Pope. Although he was from Western Australia, all 4 of the battalions in the 14th Brigade, the 53rd, 54th, 55th and 56th, were from New South Wales. It should be said that when we talk about the 2 lead assault battalions, please remember that the other 2 battalions, one in support, in this case the 55th Battalion, and the 56th Battalion in reserve, were also active during the battle. Likewise, for the Division Engineers, Machine Gun, Pioneer battalions and signal units. As you may have noticed, the Australian and German trenches are much closer together here. No man's land ranging from 250 metres in front of the 53rd Battalion to just less than 100 metres in front of the 54th Battalion. Just before the attack, an Australian of the 53rd Battalion, Charles Lorking, took out his camera and captured these famous photographs. In 1922 he told Charles Bean that he had taken the photographs about 10 minutes before the commencement of the attack. The men are members of Section 2, A Company, 53rd Battalion. Of the 8 men shown, 3 came out alive, and they were all wounded, including the photographer Charles Lorking. Once again, A and B companies in both battalions were selected to mount the assault. They commenced the advance at 5:43 p.m. The 53rd Battalion immediately received machine gun fire from their front and the 60th Battalion sector. However, both battalions were able to take the German trenches. Obviously, the 14th Brigade sector is the most visited by people today, as it now has located in it both the VC Cemetery and the Australian Memorial Park. We will look at these now. The blue line represents the position of the 53rd Battalion's trench, and the white line gives an indication of the 60th and 59th's starting line. In the background is the Trou cemetery, which is arrowed, and the 15th Battalion Pompey Elliott's outpost, which was near the end of Penny Avenue trench system. So the drone is now following the 53rd Battalion's advance on the left of the road and the 54th on the right of the road. The drone is now hovering above the Memorial Park. The northern fence of the Memorial Park is in line with the German trench and was the site of vicious fighting by the 54th Battalion. The purple sign marks the position of the German trench line. The 53rd and 54th Battalions suffered an extraordinary loss of officers. The 53rd Battalion's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Norris, and his staff safely crossed no man's land, but as the headquarters group was moving forward from this German trench, a machine gun turned on them. Norris and his adjutant and several others were killed. Norris was listed as missing for 94 years, until his remains were found and buried in Pheasantwood Cemetery. Many of the men found in the mass grave at Pheasant Wood come from these sectors of the 14th Brigade and the 8th Brigade, located behind the Memorial Park. The bodies were taken to Pheasant Wood, about 1.5 kilometres away by light railway. I'm not sure what causes the barren ground in the field. They look like shell holes. Definitely an undrained depression where the wheat will not grow. The 53rd captured the German trench. Depending on the weather, at times the easiest way to get to the 59th Battalion sector is to walk up the banks of the Lays stream. In wet times it can be quite muddy. The 53rd advanced towards Delaport Farm before being repelled, and they made their further advance to the corner, arrowed. The purple line gives an indication of the trench that the 54th Battalion defended with support from the 55th and 56th until retiring during the early morning of the 20th of July. This is the Australian Memorial Park, which has as its centrepiece the Cobbers statue, showing Sergeant Simon Fraser of the 57th Battalion carrying a wounded 60th Battalion soldier back from no man's land. The blockhouse relics are authentic, but were made later in the war after the Battle of Fromelles. The 54th was commanded by Colonel Walter Cass. Once again, the advance across no man's land was catastrophic for the 54th. Their second-in-command, Major Harrison, was killed. All 4 company commanders and their second-in-commands were either wounded or killed in the first few minutes. It would seem by some miracle Cass got through. After capturing the German trench, he moved his headquarters forward. Arrowed is the approximate position of a German concrete shelter known as the Wargarben, where Cass established his headquarters. This is also the vicinity where the German tramway began. Cass, who was the last to withdraw, was broken-hearted at the loss of his battalion. He accused the hierarchy of wholesale murder, saying that they had murdered his boys. The park fence on the left is basically the position of the German frontline trench. The final AIF sector on the left was manned by the 8th Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Tivy. They selected the 31st and 32nd Battalions as their first assault waves. The brigade had been battered by German and Australian artillery while waiting in the trenches. The 32nd Battalion had the shortest distance of any of the AIF battalions to advance over no man's land. To assist them in the crossing, a large mine was detonated on the left flank. Both battalions successfully took the German front-line trenches. However, due to poor intelligence, they were required to push on to the 2nd and 3rd German trench that actually never existed. Precious time was wasted in this fruitless search. It was realised too late that the battalions should have been consolidated on the German front line. The commander of the 31st Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Fred Toll, himself made some of the furthest scouting. Toll went as far as the Rue del Var, to this point being arrowed. This photograph is taken from Toll's position on Rue del Var, looking back towards the 31st, where Toll had left his men to dig in. Proceeding up the Rue del Var to where it turns sharply to the left, there is this farm track. About 50 metres up this track is the position where the 31st were trying to dig in. Basically, the 54th was on the left of this track and the 31st was on the right, but some distance between the two. A broken defensive line, dotted blue, was manned. This line, which basically fell in line with the 54th and the 53rd's efforts to the right. The 32nd Battalion became embroiled in an attack 70 metres northwest of Delangra Farm, at a German strong post known as the Kassenweg. As the night battle progressed, the Germans made effective counterattacks, which in the end resulted in the retirement or capture of the Australians. A German took photos of the scene of the battle in this area. We now return to the Sugarloaf approaching the battlefield from the German side. In what was another major blunder of this disastrous battle, the heads decided that at 9 o'clock the 58th Battalion would conduct another attack against the Sugarloaf. Described by Beans in the official history as one of the bravest and most hopeless assaults ever undertaken by the AIF. Led gallantly by Major Hutchinson, they went forward with splendid dash until 2/3 the way over, when the Sugarloaf opened up with the machine gun fire so severe that the line was shattered and the men dazed. Hutchinson, in a gallant display of courage, went on alone until being hit just before the German wire. All of the Australian heads recommended Major Hutchinson for a Victoria Cross. However, Hutchinson never received anything, not even a mention in dispatches. On his citation, it is written, "No trace of award." Further, no Victoria Cross was ever issued for gallantry at Fromelles. Another man recommended for the VC was Private Rowley. Rowley was a member of the 56th Battalion, but had assisted in the retirement of the 8th Infantry Brigade. He had stood up on the parapet of the enemy's trench in full view, throwing grenades. His Victoria Cross recommendation was rejected, but a DCM was awarded. On the day, this whole area in front of the German trench and along the Leys stream was covered with the Australian dead and wounded. The casualties of the 60th and the 59th Battalion alone totaled 1,400 men. The total losses for the 5th Australian Division amounted to a staggering 5,533 men, of which 1,917 were killed. The true death toll will never be known, as the men continued to die from their wounds years after they had returned to Australia. In this sector, many of the dead men were left unburied until after the war had ended. Charles Bean visited the area in 1918 and found that it was littered with the remains of Australians. So who was to blame for this catastrophe? In the year 2000, Robin Caulfield released his highly acclaimed book, Don't Forget Me Cobber, an inquiry, in which he endeavoured to answer this very question and record the history of the battle and the 19th of July men. All these books are available from booksonwar.com. We will now have a look at the other books that were used in the making of this video. The number one guidebook for us, and is basically a don't leave home without it, is Peter Patterson's Anzacs on the Western Front. It's the only book we actually take to the battlefield. Simply, it provides everything you need. Tours, maps, stories, key features. It's all there. For in-depth details of the battle, Patterson's other book, Fromelles, provides the historical facts. Matt McLaughlin's recently updated guide, Walking with the Anzacs, is a great read. I believe that Captain Ellis's book, The Story of the 5th Australian Division, published in 1920, was the first book printed to seriously write of the Fromelles battle. Ellis was a member of the 29th Battalion and was present at the Battle of Fromelles. This new reprint is available from booksonwar.com. My guess, the first port of call for any serious researcher of Australian World War I battles is Charles Bean's Official History. Fromelles is shown in Volume 3, first published in 1929. Roger Lee's book is excellent for the maps showing the course of the Fromelles battle. It's part of the Australian Army's campaign series. These veteran-authored books are excellent reading about the Battle of Fromelles. Walter Downing of the 57th Battalion first published his book, To the Last Ridge, in 1920. The Gallant Company, first published in 1933, was written by Harold Williams, a 56th Battalion veteran of the Battle of Fromelles. If one has a family history connection to the Battle of Fromelles, the battalion unit histories provide in-depth details of what was happening to the men during the course of the battle. These are only a small selection of the unit histories available from booksonwar.com. Check out our website for others. The original battalion histories are highly collectible, so these books can get rather expensive.